Welcome to this series of interviews where a range of New Zealanders with dyslexia will share their insights on where this diverse way of thinking has influenced their lives. I'm Dorenda Britten. Joining us today is Paul Reid, who is the CEO of AuthorIt, a content management and software company, a chair of Figured, a farm financial management software company, and a director of the Christchurch International Airport. Whew, Paul. So when we first met, Paul, I believe you had just discovered you were dyslexic. Is that true?
So it wouldn't have been up until probably 10 years ago that I would even admit that I was dyslexic. I hid it. And it was out of a feeling of shame, a feeling of being thought of as a dummy, as somebody who wasn't very smart, because when I grew up, you were judged by, how well you could spell, how well you could read and pronounce words, and of course your traditional sciences as well. So when you were growing up and you realized your reading ability was fairly poor, you hid it. I hid that for a huge chunk of my life and used to sometimes feel quite embarrassed by it. But I'd developed quite a few coping strategies, in life. And they were little things that some of them have actually turned out to be advantages, that you might have seen thought as a disadvantage. And someone would you'd be traveling around to different companies and businesses, and you go to sign in and you had to write down the name of the person you were visiting. I'd always if I was with somebody else, them sign in first and then just do the little ditto underneath. Yeah. If I wasn't with somebody, I would have had written out their name on a piece of paper and had it in my pocket, so that I could pull it out and copy it. You'd prepare yourself for different kind of situations. And if you're forced to draw in pictures, never use words. It was a fear of being found out and fear that everyone will realize you're a fake. And it took me a long time to realize that, leadership and intelligence and a whole bunch of other things aren't judged by whether you can read a book very well or not.
What do you remember from your school days that you believe has left the biggest mark on you?
If I remember back to school days, the worst thing that would happen, and this is at high school, you'd go around the room having to read a paragraph from a book, if you remember those days. And you'd be sitting there, your palms and hands would be sweating, and you'd get to your turn and you'd start. And then you'd hear people giggle and the giggles would starting and the laughing would start, and you'd get worse and worse because you get yourself wound up completely. Yeah. Yes, I have problems with words. I have problems with spelling and, reading and writing. And you could try and explain to me till you're blue in the face what a noun is, and I'm still just not going to get it. I'm just not going to understand what you're saying. But I was really fortunate. I'm really good at maths. That's the only thing that kept me at school. I made it into university. I had to do a summer school to get in. I studied a first year of Bachelor of Agriculture and I failed. Then after that, I quit and flipped over to a science degree in maths and stats. And then, the rest is history, work starts, etc. So how do you actually then continue to be successful from a business perspective? I don't want to define success, from a business or monetary, standpoint, but from an ability to work, and provide yourself with an income, and then ultimately my family with an income, et cetera, et cetera. Well, I quickly learned I'm not going to be able to do it by reading books and becoming very book smart and clever in a particular, skill set.
How would you describe your way of learning as a dyslexic?
What I had learned through being dyslexic was the way I learned. And the way I learned was through observation. And I was really, fortunate again when younger to work with some really great people. And I learned by watching their style, their leadership style, and how they spoke and how they approached things. And then it's by doing. So sitting in a lecture room and listening to a lecture or, learning that way just doesn't work. I'd rather bury myself in a project or an activity and just observe and learn, and then try it out for myself. I do believe everyone, regardless of being dyslexic or not, thinks differently. I know through the science that dyslexic people do conceptualize things, quite a bit differently in terms of shapes and puzzles and how you approach problems and how you think about things, which is not a disadvantage. A lot of the creative people that you meet and you talk to are dyslexic. They're wired, differently, and they think in a different way, and that for them has been really a good thing.
Paul, are you able to identify any support you have had that others may not have access to?
So I was lucky because I was given some opportunities in life that a lot of people don't. My parents were in a position where they could continue to support me at school, but a lot of children aren't in that position, usually for financial reasons. And then they are labelled as a dummy because they're not doing well at school. Self-esteem, and that can quite often lead into really bad cases of anxiety through just not being recognised that they just might think a little bit differently. It doesn't necessarily mean they're dumb. And it takes quite a while for a person with dyslexia or any form, because, there's a scale, etc., to actually think that way. And I can remember trying to read Harry McCleary to my eldest daughter, and she corrected me. And I was so pleased that she wasn't dyslexic. Now, that's actually quite the wrong thinking, because if she was, it doesn't actually matter. But as society, again, we've been just taught so much that, drilled into you or socialized into you that there's these certain standards in life that define whether you're bright or not, or whether you're good enough, or whether you can be accepted. And that has predominantly been around, your education. The other thing, though, that technology has helped massively. I use a paid subscription to Grammarly. Without that, my emails would be very difficult to understand. So we're really fortunate now with that. And as we're talking today, the way we communicate, we're now talking via video. You don't really write letters anymore in a personal communication or in a business communication. Yes, you write emails, but even emails are getting less and less and less, in terms of the length and the content. And I say to my teams, look, if you're going to write something in an email longer than a paragraph, I'd rather have a quick conversation. And the power of the verbal conversation is much stronger than the written when communicating.
During my research, I have often been told that dyslexia is a problem in the workplace for health and safety reasons. The story has been, if people learn to read and write, then they will find valuable work. I'd like to put it another way. If they learn to read and write, they can have the keys to the kingdom, but there you are. Have you discovered other ways of communicating at work, Paul?
So I can recall, would have been 20 years ago, I was working at Cut Old Harvey Forest and talking with our health and safety manager and Pat, and people were dying. How do you get your message across? And you simply employed a cartoonist, and it got the message across. People could understand it. They could read it. You just got to think a little bit outside the square. How can I address this problem to a different audience? It's just the way the world is today, and I hope that you guys are able to make an impact, and even if you just make an impact on one life of a young New Zealander, that'll be awesome. And because kids shouldn't have to go through what children did in my day.
How would you feel about efforts to diagnose dyslexia in children earlier? In your opinion, would that have been an advantage or not for you?
However you approach your journey with dyslexia, it takes time, and it's going to take time. There's no simple quick fix, because you've spent the first sort of formative part of your life being taught this is how we do things, and then to discover when you're in a young adult years that actually that doesn't work for you isn't just going to change overnight. Isn't going to change other people's behavior, and it's also not going to change, necessarily how you view yourself. My key message is don't tie up your own personal self-worth to other people's view of how self-worth should be measured. Because you're going to be in a continual loop of trying to please others and do things the way that society expects of you, from a very traditional manner, and you're going to be disappointed. And so I just say, don't attach your self-worth to something like this, because you're actually, as an individual, worth a lot more. And you have incredible talent and skills when applied, in a way that suits you.
Thank you, Paul. Your story is an inspiration, not only to people who struggle with dyslexia, but for all of us. Thank you for your time.
Thanks for that. Cool. Okay.
This is the first in a series of interviews that I am conducting for a program in the name of the late Dorenda Britten, a well-known dyslexic engineer who had to overcome many hurdles on the way to realising his potential. The program we are building takes an alternative view of dyslexia. We would prefer to think of dyslexia as a gift. We are staggered to learn of the number of dyslexic people in New Zealand and how their special view of the world is underrated.